Hello, I'm Mark Peterson, Professor of Public Policy, Political Science, and Law here at the Luskin School in the Department of Public Policy. I will be teaching Public Policy 202, American Political Institutions and Processes in the winter quarter, as you know. And this orientation is really meant to give you an understanding, a kind of setup of the context and background as to why it's important to have the course and what it means to be able to understand democratic contexts and institutions and society in order to be an effective strategic player. I'm going to do this orientation in 4 parts, recorded each individually, so you can watch them individually. And we will start by giving you a little sense of who I am, since we haven't had a chance to interact at all or to meet and converse in the way we normally would have. So let me just tell you what I think I bring to Public Policy 202. One is the body of my scholarship is in American political institutions, American government, a lot of it in healthcare, but really focusing on the presidency, Congress, the executive branch in general, presidential congressional relations. And this is where I have written and done a good deal of my scholarship, as well as on interest groups and public opinion. I'm currently wrapping up a long end process book called American Sisyphus, Healthcare and the Challenge of Transformative Policymaking. The substantive issue is healthcare reform, but the book is really about American political processes and policymaking, essentially what we're doing in this course. I've written essays on these topics and a number of edited volumes and various kinds of articles. But I've also taught a lot in this area. My previous appointments were at Harvard and at the University of Pittsburgh, where I taught a number of very specific courses, graduate and undergraduate, on the various institutions that we talk about in 202. One of the great pleasures was being able to teach the big course on the American presidency at Harvard in Harvard Hall, which was built before there was an American presidency. The Pittsburgh architecture, not quite so interesting. I've also been on a number of advisory panels, committees, boards of various sorts that have included government officials elected and appointed. I get a sense of what their needs are in the policy process. I've been directly engaged in the political campaigns of various kinds. I was a city ward chair, precinct coordinator, and been involved in a number of local and national campaigns as a volunteer. And I've done some work directly in government. With an American Congressional Fellowship, I worked as a legislative assistant for health policy in the United States Senate. And so what I try to do is weave together this combination of scholarship and personal experience and perspective to give you as best understanding I can of how to think about the political process and what that means for policymaking. So the 4 parts that we're going to cover in these pieces are part number 1. I'm going to go into why we even have a required course in American political institutions and processes. That's what I will do in this segment. The next one will be in part 2, what I call the underlying and inescapable normative issues in policymaking based on competing philosophical foundations of political differences and divisions that get reflected in our 2 major political parties in the United States and offer some empirical data to show that in the US population. The third part will be getting at, again, these normative issues in policymaking, but taking a look at them from a geographical perspective and what those differences across geography, place-based, historical, and cultural differences get translated into differences between the 2 major political parties, show you data to that effect, and also the impact on increasing partisan polarization in the United States. Part 4 will be getting into the resulting, out of all that, the resulting institutions of American government, the scope of government in the United States compared to other countries, and some of the particular features of the approach that is taken in the United States to policy issues. And the idea is for this all to be a preface to learning how to work efficaciously and become effective change agents in a democratic political institutional setting. So, part 1, why a required course on American political institutions and processes? Well, we start with why politics? Why do that at all? Well, it is, in my mind, the pathway to leadership. Uh, you can work on the best possible policy analysis in the world. It can be brilliant and it can be meaningless unless you can activate that into actual policy outcomes. And that comes through leadership. It comes through strategic sensibility, for achieving policy goals. In a way, it's really developing your personal theory of change. How do we get to the change that you want to accomplish? It's important to note that, as this individual said about a recent enterprise in California to bring down 4 dams on the Klamath River that have had terrible environmental consequences and been abhorrent to the Native American tribes that live off of that product of the river. He said hard projects like this one don't get done because they're right. They get done because of they happen when a group of people decides that failure isn't an option. Things don't happen simply because they are right. Things don't happen simply because there's good analysis. They happen through political action. So what is politics? Well, Bernard Crick, a Brit, in his book Defense of Politics, wrote that politics is the way of ruling divided societies without undue violence. It is the means by which we work through our disagreements and try to come to some resolution about how to solve collective problems. A senior professor of political science and policy at Yale, a friend of mine, Ted Marmer, some years ago put it in these terms: politics without policy analysis and policy prescription without political analysis is either silly or misleading. You cannot do one without the other and expect to get any kind of change in the end. So why American politics? A very good question, particularly given the diversity of our MP3 programming and all of you representing often countries from around the globe. Well, first, it is the dominant career path of our graduates. Most of our students who graduate will go on to work in American political settings of some kind. And even for the students who work in those settings who are interested beyond domestic issues, who are interested in international issues, those decisions are still going to be made in the domestic arena by domestic players of various kinds, whether it's international economic development, national security issues of various kinds. But what about our international students who are clearly not going to be working in the United States? They'll be working in nations around the globe. Why? What value is there for them in having a course, a required course in American political institutions? Well, for better or for worse, the United States carries a big footprint around the world in almost every imaginable issue, from international economics, trade issues, immigration, refugees, global climate change, or even what's happening in various regions around the world in which one's country may also have very strong engagements. So it's really valuable. It's important to understand what is it behind decision-making from the US government and what kinds of processes are at play, and perhaps even opportunities to influence those processes to the advantage of the policy outcomes that you are looking to achieve. But I should also note this is not just about American politics. What I want to get at here is that the course gets at underlying concepts of political and institutional processes that can be applied in any democratic setting, sometimes with some adjustments, but those are easy to understand, and also how things change over time and affect the political context. So for example, we'll talk about the collective polis, the political community of competing values versus the analytical models that we use in policy analysis that often assume optimizing individual rational actors. Or consider in any setting, whether it's even a democratic country or not, there's a mix of societal problems, there are political forces at play, and policy development that comes out of that. That's central to this kind of course in understanding. The incentives of legislators in different and changing electoral and institutional settings. Most things happen, certainly in democratic societies, through the legislative process, and it's important to understand how those institutions function and what incentives face the legislators that are in those institutions. There are also the factors that affect what we call, borrowing from economics, make to centralize or to buy to decentralize the formulation of policy making, of legislation, which is typically when we think about executives, a mayor, a governor, a president of the United States, a prime minister, where do those ideas come from that those individuals put together as part of their legislative package? Do they do it internally, or do they reach out to the bureaucracy and maybe to the legislature? We also know in all societies there are fundamental barriers to collective action and resulting biases in collective action. And we need to know what those are, why they're there, how they might be overcome, and to what effect. We use the United States as an empirical descriptive case but it's not the only place in which these forces are at play. And so we want to make sure that we have a clear understanding of them by using a kind of comprehensive empirical look at the United States. Let me give you a tour of my hometown, which this is Washington, D.C., the nation's capital of the United States, and kind of a way to get our feet wet, thinking about what it really means to look at the government and the political process on the ground. We could do this in Sacramento. We could do this in another state capital. We could do this in Los Angeles. A little more complicated in Washington, but maybe give you some visage of this. So this is the kind of core government part of downtown Washington, D.C. And we can start with the White House. You all recognize that. The White House complex is not just the White House, it's also the Eisenhower Executive Office building, where much of the executive office of the president is located, and also across the street in the new executive office building. We go from the White House to Capitol Hill, where we have the Capitol building and the various office buildings to provide space for the personal offices and committee offices in the House on the left and the Senate on the right. We also have support agencies of Congress, like the Library of Congress, which not only is a library and has extensive collections, but it's also where it's housed the Congressional Research Service, CRS, which provides support. Or let's take a look at the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, which plays such an important role using analytical processes to score and evaluate proposed legislation. Or the the Government Accountability Office, GAO, which is also an arm of Congress and provides some of the most important policy analytic work in support of government action. From there, we can look at the executive branch. And I put this between Congress and the White House, and you'll see why I do that during the course. We start with the Treasury Department, which is right next to the White House, one of the oldest buildings. Then we move the Federal Triangle, which was built in the 1930s and houses many of the Washington, D.C. presence of major cabinet departments. Oddly enough, right in the middle of that is the old Post Office Pavilion, which is now, you guessed it, the Trump International Hotel, which you hear so much about. There are other federal departments, the Department of State, obviously very important in terms of foreign affairs, national security issues, and then a whole set of other buildings that house other cabinet level departments and just a little distance away in the city. Then, of course, we can talk about the Supreme Court, the third branch of government, located right next to the Capitol building. In fact, the court used to meet in the basement of the Capitol building. And then we also have another institution of importance, the Federal Reserve, which controls the money supply and has been so instrumental in the last economic crises that we've had in the United States. It's the central bank. Then, of course, this is not governmental decision-making, but we have the Smithsonian Institution museums of various kinds along the mall. We have other particular sites like the Washington Monument and the Lincoln Memorial. And off the screen here is the Jefferson Memorial. Then up in the upper right-hand corner, we have another presidential representation in the way the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts. And next to it, a very interesting complex called the Watergate Complex. That will sound familiar to those of you who know American history. And the Watergate scandal in the 1970s, when there was a break-in at the Democratic National Committee offices there during the Nixon administration that led to the downfall of Richard Nixon. And it's the reason why every time we have a scandal in the United States, it's called something Gate, off of Watergate. Well, that's part one. And I'll now go into, stop this recording and pick up with part two. There we go.